probing and more broadly relevant field of preservation. Please welcome Jorge Otero-Pailos.
Thank you, Ted, for a great introduction. Is the sound okay here? Can everyone hear me? I'm very pleased to be here with you this evening, and I just want to, it is my first time in Tennessee, so thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having me in the school, Jason, and to Tricia, Ted, everyone that was involved in making this happen, because I know how hard it is to put together this sort of, event. And I have a special word of thanks to Christina Betanzos, who's here in the front row, who really was the sort of fairy godmother behind all of this, I think, who instigated all of this happening. But so anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I know you're probably trying to think about your semester and what you have, all the work you have ahead. So I love the fact that you're taking a little bit of time with me this evening to think about smoke, and to think about air, and to think about its relationship to architecture and to art and to the kinds of things we do. My practice is really at the intersection of art and architecture, and that intersection for me is preservation. That's how I would define preservation. And I got thinking about all of this, really about that kind of work, really as an obsession that I had with cleaning buildings. And I'll get to that obsession. You'll hear more about that obsession. But it wasn't really like some intellectual, you made me sound like really, intellectual, but I just really I was obsessed with cleaning buildings. And actually, not my own buildings, but other people's buildings. Which is weird, right? If somebody shows up at your building and goes, this thing needs to be cleaned. It's sort of rude. But really the kind of thing that I was cleaning is this sort of stuff, the stuff that was coming off of chimneys in the 19th century, really the kind of thing that really defined the atmosphere of the 19th century. And we kind of forget what that looked like, because our air is so clean, and we don't have to deal with that. But it really was, in a way, what made architecture modern, that smoke, because those were heated buildings that before were not so efficiently heated. And we often think of just the chimneys from factories, but this is residential and commercial heating. This is the coal coming off of the boilers. And when I visited the Villa Savoye, everyone was like, oh yeah, the railings are so amazing. It's what makes it look like a ship. And when I looked at the Villa Savoye, I was like, that, to me, what makes it look like a ship or is that chimney coming off the top. And in fact, probably, I got a feeling that for Corbusier, that chimney that was coming off the actual boiler was too small. So he built that curved wall around it to make it seem a little bigger, because look at how huge those chimneys are on that boat. So when I went to visit the Villa Savoye, I asked them to turn on the stove, and they did. And isn't that amazing? Like, it's sort of really interesting to think that we wouldn't have modern architecture without making this smoke. Because we can't make the plate glass and the chrome steel and all those things that were supposed to not have pollution stuck to them without actually making pollution. And we know that, for example, in building all the skyscrapers of New York, the New Yorkers went to Pittsburgh to make their steel. So Pittsburgh was called the Smoky City for a reason, because this is the middle of the day in Pittsburgh. So for about 100 years, you would walk out into the street in Pittsburgh, and it was the middle of the night, all the time. There was never really, hang on Sundays probably, when the factories were closed, you could sort of make out the sun a little bit. It's so hard to imagine that when you go to Pittsburgh today. But of course, there's been a lot of studies about what happened to people living in Pittsburgh. They had, this kid didn't get enough sun, so he didn't make vitamin D, so his bones were soft. And so he grew up like that, or, lung cancer and so on. So, that smoke has really negative connotations. We call it pollution for a reason. It's bad for you. So when America deindustrialized, the first thing that people did was, let's get rid of this stuff. Let's clean it up. Let's bring these buildings back to their original condition. And that original condition was meant to be bright and, clean. But of course, these particular buildings in Pittsburgh, their original condition was to be soiled with a lot of pollution because they were built out of terracotta, precisely because terracotta was resistant to acid rain, and unlike sandstone and so on. So it's amazing that when you look at what happened is that this whole, what was basically like the deposit of the history of Pittsburgh was just washed off. And it was taken off and put down in the rivers because it wasn't like properly put into some mound with toxic, stuff. It was just dumped it in the rivers. So why is it better to have it in the rivers than on buildings? I mean, really not bad for your health on the building. It's really terrible for your health in the water. Why do we not, you just cannot, that's what I started asking myself. Like, why is it that I cannot stand it on the building? Why is it that other people like me cannot stand it on the building? What is so wrong with this thing? So when I got an invitation from the Victoria and Albert Museum to do an artwork for their collection. And they are a wonderful historic museum with all this stuff, in it, all this historical stuff. And I got obsessed by this one thing, which is their largest object. They walk you into the room and they say, and here is our largest object in the collection. And it's this huge thing, a plaster cast of Trajan's column. Trajan's column, 1st century A.D., 12-story tall marble monument. But in 1863, Napoleon III, who the French Empire had started to colonize Europe, had made a cast of it because it was very famous, and people thought it's melting. Already pollution was getting the surface of this wonderful monument eroded. And so they said, we have to make a cast of it to preserve it for the future. It's sort of like what we're doing now with 3D scanning. Now we're like 3D scanning everything because, it's going to go, so we got to have a document. What I loved about this is that this is they made 3 casts. The one in London was actually reconstructed as a column. All the other ones, they were just laid flat as a cartoon. And what they did is that they built a chimney. They called, if you go in the records of the V&A, they called the same crews that were building these huge chimneys for the Industrial Revolution in 1872, and they built a big chimney inside, and then they attached this thing to the chimney. So for me, it was so interesting that, here it is, the largest object, and I was like, I want to clean that object. We have to clean it. It looks dirty to me. And so they, they had built this column, and then they'd close the door, and it was so filthy inside, but it was like a reverse chimney because it never actually had smoke coming out. It just had dust collecting inside. And so the question was, well, what is the object? Can I, because, it's very difficult. You get into these conversations with the curators. How are you going to clean it? Where are you going to clean it? It's all this thing about, like, how do you properly touch an object, which is very interesting. You know, what is the appropriate way of touching an object? And so they actually decided that the interior of this thing was not the object. It was only the plaster cast on the outside. So therefore, I was given free rein to clean the inside of this object. And so for me, it was very interesting because all of a sudden, you know, we could reveal the interior. So this is the cast of the interior of the column. Now, the column was so big that they had to split it in half because it was 12 stories tall. So you only, you know, you see one half and then the other half, and then there is, so already they say, this is our largest object. And you're like, wait, is it one or two objects? And then is it outside or inside? And so I cast the inside, and what you're seeing here is that chimney really just almost just pulled right out of the interior, and then hung right next to the column. And I'm going to just show you real quick to give you an idea about just what the process is for doing this. I'm just going to show you this quick video here so you can get a sense of how I do it. So here we're getting ready. We're on a scaffolding inside the top of the column. And then we take latex. So that's liquid latex. Well, I mean, it's sort of liquidy. It's sort of like pasty latex. And then we apply it to the surface of the building, in this case, this chimney, and really work it into all the crevices, and then let it dry over the course of, you know, however many days it takes, depending on the humidity. But in this case, it was like 4 or 5 days for it to dry. Now I'm just going to zoom ahead here. Let's see if the connection is going to be cooperative. Yeah, we're still applying it over there. It took a while. 3 days. There it's drying. So you get this view of it drying. That's the interior of the column. And it's just literally as it dries, as the latex dries, because the water is moving as it dries to the outside, it is sucking out with it the pollution that then is traveling into the latex, and it gets stuck on the latex and becomes part of the latex. And then what we did was to pull it off in one piece from the inside.
What you see
Then you can see here we are pulling it from the wall now. So it's a very physical affair to get these casts. You know, there it is. Yeah, so you can see we're just pulling very slowly, you know, trying to work this thing. And as we were taking it down, we had to take down the scaffolding on the inside, because otherwise we had no way of getting. Finally, we ended up with a ring at the bottom of this. And if we had left the scaffolding, we would have had to carry it 4 stories up again. So we dismantled the scaffolding as we went around. So that took quite a long time. But anyway, you get the idea there of what it is to do this. We then just going to really. This is on Vimeo, so you can always just find it on Vimeo. And then we laid it flat. You know, it was almost like giving birth. It's just like very traumatic, and all the curators were like, "Oh my God, the artwork! It's broken." And I was like, "No, don't worry. You know, it's okay. It's gonna grow to be a fine child. You know, so we. This is one of the head. That's one of the head curators of sculpture, of conservators of sculpture, and she said that this was the funnest conservation project that she'd ever been involved with. And we were doing this as the museum was running. This was a funny moment because this was now I know how museums work. So every night, the museum would shut down and be rented out to some corporation to have an event. And we were working on this thing, and all of a sudden they turned off the lights on us. And we said, well, we got to turn the lights back on. We can't work. And the head person came in and said, we can't, sorry, they need ambiance in the party next door, so we can't have any lights on. And the person that was doing the film said, it's great, it looks amazing, it's, leave them off. So anyway, you can see, then we had to do some patching here, and then we lifted it up. And what's amazing about that room is that the whole thing is, it was meant to be a poor man's travel through Europe. Because you couldn't travel, you could go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and you could see the great monuments of Europe. So it was really it's the center of the culture of Europe. And for me it was very important to put this there because this is a piece of pollution. And so to have pollution in a room that symbolizes European culture, and to say that this pollution is part of European culture, for me was really very important. And really the whole idea of the ethics of dust is to find a place for pollution within culture. Because by definition, what we call pollution is that which is outside of culture. So to bring it back into culture is the question for me. How do we do that? And so this work is really about calling attention to that. Here you have another view. We put a mirror at the bottom to double it up so this one would be one object, double the size.
It's not just about whether the object
But
is
it's like
I think,
this painting, which most of
hopefully
you
people will stop to reflect.
probably, if you took Art History 101, you were shown this painting by George Otero. The pointillism, the beginning of the breakup of form, the idea of just pure light as technique, what he was doing in terms of the representation of form. But also the other story is, well, you know that this is a Sunday because they're resting, they're bathing, and the factories are closed. There's only one sort of spewing smoke, but they're like the smokestacks are not working. So those smokestacks are really critical because they're telling you that story. Now Seurat was representing smoke, which for me is very interesting. I like to work directly with this material. And I pulled up this painting. I'm not going to lie to you. I didn't really do any research. I just Googled it when I was called by Louis Vuitton to do an artwork for their new museum, like for the entrance of their new museum. And I said, oh, okay, great, fantastic. Louis Vuitton, I know they make bags. And so I Googled it, and Louis Vuitton's factory, turns out, was in Asnières, where this is a painting of. And it turns out that those factories are Louis Vuitton's factories. I had to check with the Louis Vuitton people about that. But isn't that amazing? I had seen this painting, looked at this painting so many times, and then all of a sudden it just became real in a completely different way for me, because now all of a sudden I knew what was happening. It's part of that history that I engage with every day, that every time I see a Louis Vuitton bag, I can see that painting. And so this is Louis Vuitton's house. This is Mr. Louis Vuitton's house. And strangely, how these things happen. Mr. Louis Vuitton became famous. He was like a cheap mover. He was a mover in Paris. He was like schleppers, you would like call him up. And but he got a commission from Napoleon III, the same Napoleon that commissioned Trajan's column, to move the court from summer residence to winter residence. And that's when Louis Vuitton started making a lot of money, because he was working for government at that point. And that's where he built this house, and this was his factory ahead. Through that door came in all the materials, and then all the materials went back out, and that window over there was his office, and he would look at everything and do quality inspection. Materials coming in, goods going out, were all looked at from that point. This bridge was put in subsequently as they turned this more into a Louis Vuitton I don't know how to call this. This is like, it's still a workshop. It's still a workshop, but it's a VIP experience. It's a VIP experience. In other words, there's a lady there that if you're a VIP client, they'll host you for lunch at Mr. Louis Vuitton's house. Everything's the same as when Louis Vuitton was there. You have dinner at his table, you know, and then you go in and then you look at your bags that are being made over here. These are when I was there, they were making a big trunk with 365 watches that were moving inside this trunk for a person that needed a watch every day, and traveled with all those watches. And I was like, this is like you could assign this as a studio project. You know, like that sounds like the kind of crazy thing that you would assign as a studio project. Anyway, so I decided to, you know, I obviously was looking for the dust. I'm like, where's Seurat's dust? And this house had been all cleaned. But if you notice, and they gave me the tour, I couldn't, but then look at the brick. That brick is slightly redder than that yellow brick. So, you know, you learn to look for these things. And I was like, what's behind that brick? And that is, don't worry about that. That's just the garbage room. We made a little addition there for the kitchen, because now they put the kitchen where was his office, and that's where they put all the garbage to bring it out at night. And I was like, can we open that? So we opened it and looked in there, and there was the original pollution of the 19th century, because nobody had cleaned the garbage room. And so for the entrance to the museum, I cast that garbage room. And so the doors are to the left. The first thing you do when you walk in, the first thing you see is that. It's Mr. Louis Vuitton's house, but it's the residue, it's the offshoot, it's the pollution that Louis Vuitton made in order to make all of those bags. And the color of it is sort of interesting because it's gold, and sort of it's sort of making gold out of dust. And there's Louis Vuitton's you know, portrait on the left, a tiny little etching, and then his famous trunks. And those trunks were what every explorer that was worth his or her salt took to travel and colonize the world. You know, that was what made French imperialism possible, is the fact that they had these amazing, you know, bags and with a Louis Vuitton logo on them. So that's a little detail of the cast. Now, of course, pollution has a really negative connotation, because we're very familiar with pictures like this. Pollution does harm. This is in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. This is what happens to stone under acid rain. And so when these pictures came out in the 60s, remember, the 60s is a really pivotal moment for environmentalism. This is the moment when Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring, and we start talking about the toxicity in the environment and pesticides and acid rain and all this stuff. I mean, in reality, they were talking about acid rain already in the 1850s and 1860s, and the great American George Perkins Marsh of that period, he was an ambassador of the United States to Venice. He was already talking about pollution and climate change. So, but anyway, we are familiar with this. But what do we do about it? Well, as preservationists, when the stuff starts to melt, we come in and we replace in kind. And that's great with traditional architecture. Oh yeah, this brick looks a little bit damaged. We'll just remove it and we're going to put a new one in. It's going to look great. And that's what you see here in the Tower of London. All this bottom part has been replaced because that stone was too far gone. And we've been fighting, as artists, we've been fighting pollution forever. You know, in the 19th century, artists like Sir Richmond were the founders and heads of societies against coal smoke. Like, isn't that amazing? Like, the British do like they have societies for everything, and they like, you know, so, but there's Sir Richmond fighting king coal. So we are now, we have been at it for a long time. look at this picture of the Doge's palace. This is a building that I've been fascinated with for a long time, because I've been fascinated with Ruskin, because Ruskin was, it's funny, he was, like, if you've seen the last show of Ruskin's work, you think, wow, this is one of the most amazing artists. I mean, like, yeah, like that, just remember this one watercolor of a feather. That is just unbelievable. How did he do that? A watercolor doesn't do that. But he could observe, and he never thought of himself as an artist because he never sold a painting. He just did it, you know, because it was a way of seeing. I'm like, well, if that definition is what makes or breaks whether you're an artist or not, then like half the world would not be called an artist, because like selling a painting is actually quite a difficult and treacherous thing to do. But he looked very carefully, and he was obsessed with this building because all the Brits were obsessed with Venice because they were trying to build a naval empire, and the Venetians had had a naval empire for 1,000 years. It was on the wane in the 19th century. And this was the house of the president, of the monarch, if you will, where they had a type of democracy where they went around all the aristocrats around the table. But he wanted London to look like Venice. He wanted London to look like Venice because it was a naval empire. So he thought Gothic is the way to go. And he looked at that, and you saw that photograph, how black it was and how white the other one is. We've been cleaning that building all the time. Every 30 years that building gets cleaned. And to the point where it just looks fantastic, but everything has been eroded so much that they've actually, what they do now is that they take this piece off, and now in this window is a museum to the building. And so because they've been over cleaning it so much, they take the original capitals, they've put them all inside this, and now all of these are actually replicas, or not all, but many of them are replicas. So the building is sort of like eating itself up, you know, because it's been cleaned up too much. But we found this one wall that was right behind that arch, between the two courtyards, between St. Mark's Square and the interior courtyard of the building, that you cannot see from St. Mark's Square, and therefore nobody would pay to clean it. The whole administration was like, that, just leave it. So that thing had pollution for as long as anybody can remember. And so for the Venice Art Biennale, I proposed to clean this one wall. We had to go through all sorts of tests to try to do that, and we were able to finally apply latex to it and then to remove the pollution on it. And here's the final cast, which was in the Corderie. And then you learn stuff. You know, when you, I love doing artworks because everyone I learn something from. You know, I don't know where it's going to end up. And this one in particular, I was really like, wow, these black lines that came out, what are those? And it turns out that they coincide with some of these mortar joints over here in the corner. And what had happened was that mortar had fallen off because of freeze-thaw cycles. And they put new mortar in, white mortar, and then they'd gone in and painted that just to match the existing wall. And I was like, wow, that's phenomenal. Like, how did that? And so I went and asked the local authority on conservation and restoration, said, is that normal? Is that normal that they would paint buildings black? He's like, funny you should ask. I'm working on this building over here, which is the Mancha. Is like where it's the mint. It's where they made the money that they gathered. That's where they made the coins. He said, and you'll be surprised what I found out. They actually painted this building black in the 19th century. I'm like, how do you explain that? They're like, well, they hypothesized that the Brits would come to Venice and they would say things like, that doesn't look old at all. That looks really new. It's all white. You know, London is black. All our old buildings are black. And so the Venetians, they were a little worried about losing the tourist dollars, and they started painting their main buildings black so that they looked a little bit older, which I love that idea, you know. I'd love to paint, say, I don't know, the White House black. It would be sort of interesting. But what's amazing, though, is he got into a lot of trouble because he tried to clean that. And when he realized it was not actual pollution, but the work of a human being painting the building black, he said, this is intentional, original intention. I am not going to clean this. So 3 million euros later, they pulled down the scaffolding, and Venetians just had a field day on the newspaper. They're like, how could it be? We spent 3 million euros. They didn't do anything. This mayor is a shame, you know. And there is this, you know, very brainy, scholarly conservator trying to explain why that's the way it should look. Very difficult to do in the press. But it's so interesting to think, okay, if it's man-made, then we keep it. If it's pollution, then we don't. But isn't pollution man-made? Like, didn't we make that stuff too? We just didn't maybe intend it. So we're working on this idea of intention, of original artistic intention as the basis for which to keep or not keep the facades dark. And aren't we beyond original intention, like as a field in the world of art, in the world of architecture? Isn't that sort of, you know, are we beyond that after Duchamp and, you know, the ready-made and other, you know? So for me, it's very interesting to think of this question that we actually still consider that stuff on the walls as something we didn't make. Because when we do think about it as something we made, then we say, wait a minute, I made that. It's like narcissism, right? Like, I made that, therefore I keep it, you know. This is another project, very interesting, in the north of Italy, where Mussolini, you know, the north of Italy, they speak German. Did you know, have any of you been to Alto Adige? It's great wine, by the way. You could go there and never come back out. But it's the pre-Alps, and it belonged to Austria before World War I, and then as a settlement, Italy got that. And Mussolini thought, you know what? I don't like them speaking German in Italy. I'm going to send a bunch of southern Italians to this region because they're beautiful, they're going to mix with those northern types, and everyone's going to speak Italian pretty soon. And this was the 1930s, this was 1937, and Hitler heard about this. And he said, I will not have it, because the Germanic race is the southern Italians that should start to learn German here, actually. Right? And so he sent the tanks to the border of Austria and almost went to war with Mussolini. Can you imagine the history of the world, what it would have been if a fire had, they'd shot one gunshot? It would have been totally different. But actually, Mussolini backed down. He said, you know, this was a bad idea. I think you're right. Maybe we build a separate town for the Italians, and they're just here temporarily. So actually, they still speak German over there. But this factory is now being reconverted into a cultural center, and they had Manifesta, the European Contemporary Art Biennial here. And so I came in and asked that they would let me clean one of the walls and make that wall, save the dust on that. So you can see the sides, they've already cleaned that up and painted it white, so that's all clean. And the back wall is still to be, you know, this is some of the dust, and so this, we're just transferring the dust from the surface of that wall. Here you can see the factory clock and the electrical chase over there, and there you see another image of that, you know, with the big, you know, people. It's very tactile. People like to touch it. You see the wainscoting where there was no dust on that part because that's what they cleaned, and a bit of a close-up of what that looked like. Now this was a different project, and again, like each project has taken me in a different direction and trying to figure out, you know, frankly, what it is that I'm doing, you know, like why am I interested in this stuff? And this was in Spain. This was a Roman mine where they made silver. The Romans made silver. Fascinating story, because the Romans actually, coins were invented about 600 BC, and then the Roman Empire starts picking up around 400 and starts really rising. And because coins allowed a different kind of economy, you could bring a lot more people into your economy if you had the same coin. You didn't have passports, but you had the same coins. So what the Romans did is that they would enslave populations that lived around a silver mine. They would make them make the metal for free, as slaves do. Then they would, over 1 or 2 generations, they would make them citizens 1 or 2 generations later. And then the money that they made made it possible to have more people in the empire, and then they'd make them soldiers, and then they'd go and attack the next mine until they ran out of mines. And that's Hadrian's Wall in the north of England. They were like, okay, we're out, and then the empire started going south. But this is what they left. They were incredible engineers. They pumped water inside of mountains and fracked them and turned them inside out. And that's literally the moonscape that was left behind after the Romans. And this has been opened up. All this ended after Spain discovered the silver mines in Peru. So basically, this mine was opened and closed over the years, and then nobody paid attention to this because there's so much silver coming from South America. But if you look at environmental pollution, and people have done this, you could read the science journals, it's amazing. Environmental pollution during the course of the Roman Empire goes up, 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 up. And then at the 4th century or so, when the empire stops, environmental pollution drops, and then it stays low until the discovery of the Peruvian mines, and then it goes back up. But it's a different kind of dust in the air. And so here I went and cleaned these mines, and this was shown at a university gallery in Sydney, because in Australia, one of their main exports is coal. All the coal, not all, but a lot of the coal that's burnt in China is produced in Australia. And so they were very interested in this idea of resources extraction and so on. And so we exhibited this, which has pieces of it of dust from the Romans, the pollution that the Romans made. And what was amazing was that the Romans, there was this, in 1992, the Europeans made this ice core project to drill into the Arctic and figure out the history of the planet through those little Arctic deposits. And they found pollution from that mine in Spain. They found pollution from that Roman mine in Spain in the North Pole. So I was like, Google Earth. Immediately Google Earth. What is 5,000 kilometers? I don't even know what that is in miles, but, a lot. It's not like, the Romans never made it that far. Like, we know they never made it that far. So clearly this had to be blown into the air and make it over there. But if you think about it, it wasn't just a beeline, because when you think of the trade winds, if they were making that smoke in Spain, it had to fly out, go down to South America, up through Tennessee, and then up to the North Pole. So the Romans polluted the atmosphere, like the world's atmosphere. See, I always thought that it was the 19th century, that it was industrialization. If that's what makes us modern, then the Romans were modern. If polluting the world is what makes us modern, then the Romans got us started. And isn't that phenomenal, to think that that stuff is still there? 2,000 years later, we don't have a lot of the Roman Empire left 2,000 years later. Like, most of the buildings and artworks that you're all going to make will not be around 2,000 years later. Certainly my latex stuff is not going to be around 2,000 years later, because it has a very, short by comparison lifespan. But that to me was mind-blowing, that it's like, okay, so that stuff that's in the air is actually one of the monuments of the Roman Empire. That's one of the monuments of the Roman Empire. It is maybe one of their longest lasting monuments. And if you think about the fact that the Roman Empire had 70 million people at its height, that the average age lifespan was 20. So like people died after 20. Many of you would still be alive. No? Maybe 2 or 3 of you would still be alive. But now we're 7 billion on the planet. And we live, it's like hard to make us die, actually. Have you seen how hard it is for somebody to die? They like put them in the hospital for 3 years. It's like horrible. So we last forever. And, you know, like the magnitude is so much greater. So I really, you know, I was like, I got this opportunity to work in San Francisco, where they made the money of the United States. So I was like, I can't pass that up, you know, because there's the gold rush. And it turns out, and I didn't know this, but, you know, it's like when you're looking for a bathroom, you know, like you have to, like you see bathrooms everywhere. You have to go to the bathroom, or you're looking for a gas station, you're like, oh, there. You develop like a sixth sense for bathrooms and gas stations. So in San Francisco, this is one of the only buildings that survived the earthquake of 1906, the Granite Lady. It was built by the federal government to last earthquakes because that's where all the money was. It couldn't have it crack open during an earthquake, and it survived. But that's where all the money, all the ore went, and those chimneys are where they heated it and made it into coins. So, you know, when they made it, then they would store it, and here are some of those vaults inside the building where they, you know, these are still the coin, putting pressure on those. These are safety deposit vaults, and then from there they would be circulated to banks and so on. But between the roof and the ceiling of the next level, those 2 chimneys had never been cleaned, and so we went in and cleaned the 2 chimneys and made this cast of the 2 chimneys. And that's an SF MoMA now. So, you know, I'm very happy that they made that part of their permanent collection as part of the history of San Francisco and of the United States, really. So this is really a piece that you can walk inside and see both sides of, which is, you know, it's very different on the one side and the other. You can see sort of looking through that window that the inside looks more like as if you were looking at the stone itself, because actually most of what we see is just dust, you know, but we don't think about it that way because we think of ourselves seeing through the dust. But when you remove the dust and you look at it from the other side, it looks pretty much as what you see. It looks like either, you know, brick or stone or whatever. But I started thinking about this idea that, okay, so here I am collecting dust from all these different monuments around the world. And I started this process thinking, okay, well, I'm working, the cultural object that I'm working on here is the monument. But then, after the project with the Roman Empire and the San Francisco Mint, I started thinking, you know, really what I'm casting here is the deposit of the atmosphere in different places. It's really the atmosphere that is landing on monuments in different places around the world, and that's what I'm looking at. That's the pollution. And now, we never see the atmosphere. It's like an impossible object, because you can't, I mean, you look up, you see right through it, you look sideways. Sometimes when you're on a plane, you can barely catch a glimpse. And it's not that image of Apollo 13 of the blue marble, because even if you were to say, oh, that's the atmosphere, it's actually, you're not seeing the backside of it. So it's a really hard object to visualize. And so we can say we all live in the atmosphere. I'm not sure we've all seen the atmosphere. So for me, this is a way of starting to see pieces of the atmosphere. But I was thinking, okay, how is this impossible? How can I think about this? What are other kinds of objects that are sort of distributed in different places? And I found this project by Leo Schmidt, a professor of preservation at Brandenburg University of Technology, who his obsession is, where did the Berlin Wall go? Because he lived with the Berlin Wall. That was his life. And then he's like, it's gone. And so he spent his life mapping every piece, where it is. And so he has this huge map of the world. And, he found one in the wall of the National Army Museum in London in this garage, just sitting there in the middle of the street. There's a wonderful one here at the, University of Virginia. What it's doing there, it's like somebody gifted it. There's another one at the United Nations. And it's so fascinating to me that if something's important, people are going to take a piece of it. And major monuments, the big important buildings, hopefully you're going to build these. People will steal your buildings. Isn't that amazing? They'll steal the doorknobs off of the Villa Savoye. They have to have cameras now because people will be like, and they'll take like a doorknob off of it. Souvenirs. But you're trying to take something that's... Did you do that? Did you take one? I saw you nodding. Well, that's why they make replicas now, so you can... But this has been happening all along. I mean, Elgin, Brits claim he bought these pieces. And the Greeks say he stole these pieces of the Parthenon. But this is London. This is the Parthenon. Now, when you go to the Parthenon, and you pay lots of money to go all the way to Greece, you want to see the Parthenon. And then they take you up on the hill and they say, actually, we moved most of it down into this museum by Bernard Tschumi because of environmental concerns, because there's a lot of pollution in Athens, so we have to protect it. So we moved it over here. But these pieces, when you go there to see the Parthenon, they're in London. So, okay, and then you go to London and they say, well, actually, we're missing some pieces over here because some of them are in Paris. And then in Paris they tell you, well, the Vatican has a few pieces of the Parthenon too. And so, where is the Parthenon? You think you know where the Parthenon is, and you go, you're like, the Parthenon is in Greece. But it turns out you're making that up when you say that, because the Parthenon is not in Greece. The Parthenon is spread out all over the world, or all over Western Europe at least. And then we have a copy somewhere nearby, which you might know about. That's super interesting, right? So how do we think about architecture? How do we think about art when we don't quite know where the object ends? When we, just like Trajan's column, they're like, nah, that's not part of the object, right? So, okay, but that's touching the object. Are you sure? And like, yeah, go ahead and clean it. But how come the piece that's of the Parthenon that's in London is still part of the Parthenon? Like, how did they argue that one? That's what I'm very interested in, because how do we argue the relationship? In our mind, we imagine objects. We imagine the work of art to be something that holds together, but it doesn't have to physically be next to one another. So this is the last project I'll show you. I got a commission from Art Angel, which is a public art foundation in London, to do a public artwork. And I said, I have this crazy idea. I'd like to collect the dust of Parliament, of Westminster Hall. And they said, perfect, let's do it. Okay. So we spent 6 years working with parliamentary estates to clean Westminster Hall. Now, Westminster Hall is a very interesting story because it is the oldest building that you can physically touch the stone where parliamentary democracy began. Now, we all think about the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is they cut the head of the king and no absolute power. But Charles I, who wanted to be like Louis XIV, Louis XVI's grandpa, said, I'm going to be absolute power, and I'm going to dissolve Parliament. And his family had signed on the Magna Carta, which checked and balances of absolute power. Parliament took him into that very building, that's Westminster Hall, which was the courts, that was the royal courts, that was his courts. He's the king. It says royal courts, people. Like, they're judging me, right? They judged him and sentenced him to death and cut his head off. That's pretty phenomenal. I mean, cutting off somebody's head is sort of the ultimate demonstration of power. The Parliament said, we have power here. That's the beginning of Western democracy. It's not the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks are a nice retro invention. But this is it. I mean, this is where they did it. And they had the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the courts, and then the executive, the king. So we didn't invent that. We have Congress and the Senate and the et cetera, the Supreme Court. It's the same, except that we chop the head of the king every 4 years, right, symbolically, and start over. So it's a phenomenal space, and it's a Gothic space. It was built in the 11th century. It's 1,000-year-old. In the fire of 1834, the whole Parliament burnt down, but they put all of their resources in saving this space. And they did, and they saved it. And so it's still there. And so when they rebuilt in the Gothic style in the 19th century. That was Charles Barry's design. And not in the classical style like Soane wanted to do, because this building was Gothic. So this is the Gothic seed of Parliament. This is why Big Ben looks Gothic. And so we spent, as I said, 6 years cleaning the walls. They had never been cleaned. This is a sort of midway shot of what it looked like, cleaned and uncleaned. And this was a very large production, as you can imagine, with collaboration with parliamentary estates, with all sorts of stakeholders here to do this. And then we could only do it in little pieces because Westminster Hall is where the royalty lies in state. So there is a protocol in place that if the king, the queen, the prince, and whomever dies, they lie in state there, and everything in that hall needs to be removed in 6 hours. So we had to have this protocol that every little piece that we would do could be removed in 6 hours. So we had to do it in pieces. I wanted to do one continuous, thing, but I couldn't do that. And so actually, I think it turned out better because I couldn't do that. Because you can see here the little pieces, of the little patchwork that we had to do, and sort of tells the story of its own, of its process of making. And so then we installed it back in Westminster Hall and inside the space. This is the plaque that tells you, these are plaques that tells you Charles I was tried to death over here, and Thomas More, the writer of Utopia, was tried to put to death. A lot of people were put to death over there. It's like, is this what democracy's about? It's just putting people to death. But completely by coincidence, when we put that thing up, we went to sleep, and I woke up the next day, and there had been this thing, we knew there was this vote about staying in the European Union or whatever the night before, but we didn't pay any attention to it, and then it turned out that they voted to leave the European Union. And so they're like, they stole our thunder. We've been working for 6 years to do this opening, and now we got to deal with Brexit. So it was amazing. It was amazing because that gap right here, that's the opening to the House of Commons. So, and through these steps, you go up to the House of Lords. So when this happened, it was like a world historical moment. And they were all running around in there dazed and confused. For me, it was a very scary moment because I was like, okay, these are the people that are leading us, and they I'm looking at their face right now, and they look like somebody that just saw a car accident or something. They're just completely lost. And it's sort of amazing, you know, and they were hiding behind here to sort of, you know, take their phone calls and try to... but what was interesting is the way that people experienced the piece was that it gave historical depth to the events that they were living in right now, right then. So it gave a sense of continuity to what they were experiencing, this radical, almost, you know, break with their history. They literally experienced as a break. But for those that went and visited, and I think it was a summer public art project, and, you know, literally hundreds of thousands of people went to see it. It was a ticketed entrance. And I think people went to see it because it gave them this sense of continuity in rupture. And I think that's one of the roles of preservation, is to really think of the role that architecture and art and the objects around us, the role it has in helping us to understand our relationship to history and to experience, to past, to the future, to put it in context. We have a really difficult time putting, you know, like imagining continuity, because I don't know if I can't remember what I had for breakfast 2 weeks ago. I don't know, you know, I have a hard time, right? Like, what was I wearing on the first day of high school? I have no idea. But if you have the picture, or if you have a way of pulling it back together, we're constantly remaking our story. And art helps us remake our story. And architecture helps us remake our story if we see it that way. And we have this idea that art has to be all about radical breaks and changing this, and, you know, I'm going to invent a new way of everything. And same with architecture. And the other thing is, well, I'm just going to copy everything exactly the way it is, you know, make traditional architecture and not invent anything. But there is some mixture there, I think, of providing an opportunity to change, to subtly change things, like just clean a building, and then begin to actually see the world slightly different and still provide that sense of continuity that helped to create a link for us. That is what we call reality, because reality has that depth precisely because we have time. Otherwise, we're just like fish, you know, goldfish in the present all the time. So this was really interesting about that I learned from this project, was this notion, the importance of objects, big objects, public objects, objects that we share, objects that don't belong to anyone, but that we all feel a stake in. The role of those objects to help us put together an image of reality for ourselves, of who we are, and give a sense of that path of our culture, of where it comes from and where it's going. And so I think that that's really at the heart of what we call cultural significance. And if we do our work right as artists and as architects and as preservationists, I think that we are making culturally significant objects. We're called cultural producers for a reason. And so I think we need to really think about culture. What is it? What do we bring to culture? How do we help to move it in directions that are really positive, rather than imagine that the only way to really influence culture is to throw it out and start over. So with that, I'll maybe stop and thank you for your attention. Okay. Thank you. Yes, sorry.
I'm a printmaker, so I can't help but think about your trading column as being in a room full of copies, as being a kind of print, another kind of copy of a copy the inside turns out. So it's interesting to think about what you're doing as a form of printing from buildings while you're cleaning them. Is this
Yeah.
Or do you even care about that?
Yeah. No, I do care about it. I mean, aura, it's an interesting, what does it mean? But I don't, I've read Walter Benjamin a few times. I love Walter Benjamin because when I'm done with Walter Benjamin, I'm like, that sounded great. What the hell did he say again? Like, what did, so, aura is this, yeah, like if I maybe can use my own words, I do think that objects are not just out there, and we're not just here. That there is something in between the two, and that we actually cannot live. It's sort of stupid to say it, but we cannot live without those objects. It's like, of course we cannot live without these objects. Otherwise we'd be some metaphysical being. But it's more than that. It's more that, like, we cannot really understand ourselves without those objects. And so I think aura or significance is like when you really understand that object is, like, you need that object. Like when, that moment when you sort of realize, oh yes, I do need that object. I can't just live by myself without it. I don't know if there's some objects like that in your life, but that is what I'm trying to do here, is that when you start to take that object away just ever so slightly, like, then you start to realize, wait a minute, I need that. Don't take it out. I need that thing. So I think that's when you begin to realize that there is a connection. Maybe you can call it an aura but it's not the aura of the object. It's the aura between you and the object. You're required to be part of that. So I think you realize that connection when you start putting, I love that idea of this is a print, because it is a print. And the print is in front of the thing, and then you can't quite look at the thing, but you can go around it and sort of be like, it's sort of standing in the way, but at the same time showing you the thing. And I think that's very important, for me, because very literally this thing is sitting between people and things, in that space between people and things, but it's trying to operate more conceptually in the space between people and things, so that we begin to maybe realize our dependence on things, or at least I realize it. So that's enough for me, that I'm like, wow, because when I went to Westminster Hall, and I was in there, I was like, I told a friend of mine, I'm like, wow, I was like really moved by this space, and I'm not even like British, like I don't, like, is that right? Is it wrong? And he has a very sort of high-minded Frankfurt School, things like, that's called ideology, my friend. And I was like, oh, I guess so, but I'm like, it's not bad, It's like ideology is always what the other people have, It's like, you have ideology. I don't know. It's like a disease or something. I'm like, well, I still love the building, But anyway, yeah.
Thank you for, I really enjoyed your witty and informative talk. And I was just curious if you are thinking about the long-term disposition of your work. You mentioned that they're not going to last for 2 millennia, but I'm wondering, I think what the stake might be, if this is the dust from Westminster, what happens to that in the long term? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the dust itself, I don't think is gonna really suffer, but but it's the latex that is an organic material that will, yeah, I haven't figured if anybody, $100, anybody that can transfer it back into an inorganic material. Yeah, I wish, in an ideal world, to be perfectly honest, I would love to find a way to do this in a way that I can guarantee that it's going to last forever. But what's going to last forever? I mean, who decided that a work needs to last 300 years? I don't know. That's the Renaissance, because they painted on these very durable things. But there is room, for ephemerality too in art. I mean, you get caught up in the whole sort of cycle of endurance and things, lasting. I am not too worried about it personally, but I know other people do worry about it. And they do worry about it because Eva Hesse's work, became brittle 60 years later, and the collectors are not happy, and what's going to happen, and the Guggenheim was not happy, but what we do know, thanks to Eva Hesse, is that they shouldn't treat this as stone. They should treat it like paper. So if you keep it away from UV light in a constant humidity, then it will last a very, 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 very long time. But if you put it in your living room in a glass box, then it will become brittle. Apart from that, I don't know. I mean, this was interesting. This piece was sectioned off, and it was given to each of national collections in all the nations of the UK. So Northern Ireland got one, Wales got one, Scotland got one, England got one, and then the Museum of London also got one. It was an exceptional sort of, and I kept a couple, but I think that they didn't worry too much about like how long it was going to last. I don't know. I mean, I do have conversations with the conservators. Inevitably call me, and they're like, "You have a conservation plan for this thing? You're a conservator." I'm like, "Yes, take good care of it." It's like, no, I mean we do talk about it. We do. I'm like, that nothing lasts forever. So, and they know how to. They treat it like a tapestry. They roll it up. They turn it 60 degrees every, year or so, and that. It will last a lot longer than maybe it would be, maybe meant to be or something. I don't know. But what I always say is the work is not made entirely by the artist. I mean, the artist makes the work, but yeah, it could be destroyed by the owner. You don't own it after you make it. It's somebody else's, and I'm very interested in that. I'm also for me, I also am not really at the origin of this, because I didn't sit there and put the dust on the wall. I took it off, so I'm not. It's a response. For me, the form of creativity here is one of responding to the work. My response is to clean it. The work is the building also. It's not just the dust, so that's not going away. And so it's the fact that because it's a print, it's always in relationship to the original building. It's very interesting because we made this imprint. I'm going to call it an imprint now. And then they restored the wall. So this has cracks in it that now are gone because they're restored. So it's the same and different. The other thing that ended up happening is, you can't see it in this image, but we saw these ghosts like on this thing, and we're like, Shroud of Turin, call the Vatican, and it turned out that we didn't know this, because we were like, really, do you really see it? Like, no, seriously. And then some historian pulled out an image of Westminster Hall where they had put these sculptures against the wall of famous kings and so on, and the dust had settled around, and so they really were these but you didn't see them until you took the dust out and really revealed that. So, yeah. Thank you. I would love to go back to these places. I don't know that I'll be able to, just because it's such a privilege to be there once. It feels like wrong to be like, I want to be there one more time. But what I think that I hear what you're saying. So the desire is there to go back, but why would I want to do that? I think for me, one of the things that also has come up for me in terms of this work is that I started to look at buildings as environmental sensors, like long-term environmental sensors, that they have thousands of years of environmental, monitoring. And that's really interesting because we actually don't have any data, real data. We have the geological data, but we don't have data about the environment even 200 years ago. Remember that weather, we didn't know what it was going to rain tomorrow or not until basically the 1870s. So the weather is a very recent phenomenon, and weather, like data collection, is maybe 50 years old, and the rest is all like speculation. Not speculation, but really difficult triangulation. So if we can use these monuments also as environmental data. So if I were to go back again, or if I invite you to go back, like how, it's a research problem. Like how do we use monuments to tell us something about the historical environment that we can't tell otherwise? And I think if we really microscopically, globally think about, like really study these things, we might find something that other people haven't found, that they're looking for in those ice drilling things. And there was this group in Norway that started collecting dust. I'm very interested in this stuff. I mean, like I said, like you guys get great grants. Like you get like this thing with the wood. I mean, we have to talk about this wood. I mean, like they collected gutter dust. So everybody that does dust stuff, I sort of, so they collected gutter dust, and what they found was extraterrestrial material in the gutters of Norway. And they're like, whoa, what's going on? And it turns out that we are constantly being, like space dust is constantly hitting us. But it just sort of disappears and we don't think about it, and that's part of what's in the atmosphere is space dust. But but it turns out that whatever the gutter system that they have in Norway, really like it just collects it really well. And so they were able to start measuring just how much hits us from this little building and that little building. And so I think the computational capacity that we have now, if we could like map every single 1,000-year-old monument in the world and figure out where it stained and how, and that would be a phenomenal bit of information. That this would be just a start of that, right? But that could be really fascinating. So I would go back that way, but I don't know that I, go clean that. And then you could sample this dust as part of that project because you would know exactly where that dust came from. So be one way. And maybe if there's one last question, I could yeah. Well, maybe two, since you guys were in line. So.
Do you know the project, and if so, what do you make of the Dusty Relief project that Francois Roche proposed, the Bangkok Museum that collects dust?
Yes, yeah. That sort of looks like a fur ball.
Yeah, right.
I think Francois Roche is a really fascinating architect and an incredibly bright person. I think that project is really sort of acknowledges the capacity of architecture to register the environment, because I don't know if other people know, but it's basically a series of antennas coming off of a building, and it just collects, almost like a magnet, like those magnet things. And then it looks like a furry animal in the end. It looks like a... But what he does is to show what architecture could do to clean up the environment. Like we are making green architecture, which is, the idea is Green architecture is just going to use less coal. It's not going to like stop using energy or whatever. It's just going to use less of it. So because we're so many in the world, there's less food to go around, less energy food. So we each got to eat a little less. So nobody likes to hear you're going to get a little smaller piece of the apple pie, you know. So, but he's saying, you know, what if architecture could just clean up the environment, like literally? What wouldn't that be? And I think there's something really phenomenal there. All these buildings, in some way, have collected the environment. So that's just putting it on overdrive in some way. But I think he's a really interesting person, and he thinks of architecture in terms of protocols as opposed to final forms. We've collaborated on one project, Francois and I. But it was a competition and we didn't win. But I think he really has a sort of post-disciplinary approach to architecture. You know, he is not invested in the idea of what architecture should be. He's invested in the idea of what architecture could be. And I think that's really important to have those kind of people in every discipline, because our discipline, you know, is getting old. You know, architecture was a discipline made to feed the Industrial Revolution. I mean, lots of architects are needed to figure out how are you going to put all these fabricated pieces together. And so we made architecture schools in the 19th century to accompany the Industrial Revolution. We're still teaching architecture as we, you know, okay, there was the Bauhaus and all that stuff, which was basically about the Industrial Revolution just with the chrome finish on it. And you know, we're still teaching it in exactly the same way. And I am not sure that that is right, because then that's what it should be. But we are thinking about what architecture should be in terms of the 19th century. It should be about efficiency. So that's BIM, you know, efficiency, getting it right, reducing liability problems, you know, doing more with less. That's what the 19th century tried to do, doing more with less. So I think now we're in a different sort of revolution, which is a kind of environmental revolution, and architecture is approaching that environmental revolution with the thinking of the 19th century. Roche is probably one of the few that's saying, let's really think about this. You know, what would architectural education be like? But it's very hard because, as you know, this architecture education is a well-oiled machine, and you know, all of you that are coming in to study architecture have to convince your parents that you're going to be all right, that you're going to have a job, that you know you're going to be fine. So it's hard to make any change in a system that is trying to. It's a professional school. It's trying to teach you a profession. It's trying to get you out there and be functional. So I don't know where that happens. I don't know where students can begin. It sort of happens in some studios. Sometimes, you know, if the professor is given enough flexibility to really think about what could be, I think it can. I think that's why, for example, opportunities that you know, if I were the president of this university, there you go, I would bring art and architecture together, because I think that at a certain level, both are doing the same, and that you can't really get, you know, you're so. When you try to go down the path of a discipline, you reach a point when you realize that you can't advance any further unless you make connections to other disciplines. And so how do universities deal with that? They create institutes. And they bring faculty from different schools to test out whether this is possible. So now you have the Mind Science Institute, the Computation This Institute. And the environmental institutes, they only have environmental scientists, engineers. There's no artists. There's no architects. There's nobody thinking about culture in those institutes. Like, if we thought about culture first, it's like smoking, right? Okay, somebody can put on a package of smoke. You will die if you smoke this. You will get this lump coming out of your throat and you couldn't breathe and you will die a slow, nasty death. You say, that's nasty. Let me give him, you know. Right? The way that we stopped smoking is we made it uncool. Simple. I mean, it was about a cultural transformation. You could give people all the science, all the information, all the whatever you want. And then there was a follow-up, a kind of really powerful legislation of mayors that decided, you're not going to smoke in bars. Oh, nobody's going to have a drink. No, you see, people are still getting drunk, you know, but they're not smoking. But it was not the science. So that's why I think architecture, art, and in fact preservation is scientifically informed art. I mean, that's what we do. But it's about culture. So I think art and architecture are really part of the way in which you could approach the environmental revolution. Because we deal with culture. And unless we change the culture of walking, culture of, you know, moving, the culture, you know, then we're not going to have sustainability, I don't think, you know. But anyway, maybe Christina, I think you're a student. So since we're gonna have dinner, we can chat later, and I'll take you as the last question. Is that all right? So you mean between the building and the skin? The only piece that I've done that you can walk in it and not around it is the San Francisco Mint. And it is it's a very disturbing thing, actually. It's a very, you know, believe me, they almost shut down the exhibit, you know, well, because it's in California, so that already is, you know, and so somebody, their label said, you know, the ethics of dust, work made of latex and pollution. So somebody visited and said, huh, pollution? And then and because you're enveloped in it, and then it had a sort of